The sun was barely a smudge of grey against the obsidian glass of the Manhattan skyline when Julian Thorne arrived at his office. As the chief financial officer of Sterling and Vance, Julian's life was measured in basis points, quarterly yields, and the cold, hard logic of spreadsheets. At 38, he was the youngest CFO in the firm's history, a man who had traded his soul for a corner office that looked down on the world he no longer felt a part of. To Julian, people were variables, sometimes assets, often liabilities. He thrived in the sterile, air-conditioned silence of his high-rise sanctuary, far above the messy, unpredictable streets of New York City. However, the silence was broken that morning by the arrival of Marcus, the firm's CEO and Julian's longtime mentor. Marcus didn't sit. He paced the length of the Persian rug, his face a mask of concern. "The board is restless, Julian. They see the numbers, and they're impressed. But they see the man and they're terrified. The press is calling you the Ice King. There's a rumor that you're about to gut the pension fund of that textile firm we just acquired. It's a PR nightmare. We need to humanize you, and we need to do it fast." Julian didn't blink. "My job is to maximize profit, not to be liked. If they want a mascot, they should hire a golden retriever." "It's not a joke," Marcus snapped. "There's a gala in 2 weeks, the Foundations of Hope event. Every major investor will be there. You need to show up with more than a calculator in your pocket. You need a partner, someone who represents the human side of our brand. If you show up alone and cold again, the board will vote to bring in a co-CFO to handle relations. You know what that means, Julian. You'll be sidelined." Julian felt a flicker of genuine irritation. He hated the performative nature of high society, but he hated losing control even more. After Marcus left, Julian spent the afternoon staring out at the city. He needed a solution, a transaction. He didn't need love. He needed an image. That evening, driven by a rare impulse to walk instead of taking his car, Julian cut through a small park near Grand Central. The temperature had plummeted, and a biting wind whipped through the canyons of stone. Near the entrance of a subway grate, he saw her. She wasn't like the other homeless people who usually avoided the aggressive security of this district. She sat tucked into a corner, wrapped in a threadbare coat that had seen better decades. Beside her was a small boy, no older than 5, sleeping with his head in her lap. She was reading to him by the dim light of a street lamp, her voice a soft, melodic hum that seemed to defy the harshness of the environment. Julian stopped. He didn't know why. Perhaps it was the way she held herself, with a quiet, battered dignity that reminded him of a statue under siege. An idea, reckless and purely logistical, began to form in his mind. If the board wanted humanity, he would give them a story they couldn't ignore. He would take the most invisible person in the city and make her his greatest asset. He approached her, his bespoke Italian shoes clicking sharply on the pavement. She looked up, and Julian was struck by her eyes. They weren't defeated. They were alert, guarded, and surprisingly intelligent. "I have a proposition for you," Julian said, reaching for his wallet. The woman didn't look at the money. She shifted, subtly shielding the sleeping boy. "I'm not looking for trouble, sir." "I'm offering a job," Julian corrected. "A temporary role. Food, shelter, and a significant sum of money in exchange for your time and your cooperation. I need a wife for 2 weeks, or rather, the appearance of one." The woman stared at him, a slow frown deepening on her face. "You're serious?" "I'm a man of business," Julian replied, "and right now, my business needs a soul. You seem to have one to spare." She looked down at her son, then back at the cold, beautiful man standing before her. "My name is Elena," she whispered, "and this is Leo. If you touch him, or if this is some kind of sick game, I will find a way to make you regret it." Julian nodded, unaffected by the threat. "I'll have my driver pick you up in an hour. Be ready." As he walked away, Julian felt a surge of triumph. He had found his asset. He didn't realize that by bringing Elena into his glass fortress, he was inviting the very thing he had spent his life avoiding: the truth. The penthouse at the top of the Silverton building was a masterpiece of minimalism. Everything was white, gray, or chrome. It was a home designed for someone who never intended to stay long. When Elena and Leo arrived, they looked like ink blots on a pristine canvas. Leo clung to his mother's leg. his eyes wide as he took in the floor-to-ceiling windows. "This is where you'll stay," Julian said, gesturing to a guest wing that was larger than any apartment Elena had ever lived in. "There are clothes in the wardrobes, various sizes, I had my assistant guess. There is food in the kitchen. Tomorrow, a stylist will arrive to begin your transition." Elena touched the surface of a marble countertop, her fingers trembling slightly. "Why us? There are thousands of women in this city who would kill for this. Professional actresses, even." "Actresses can be found out," Julian said, pouring himself a glass of scotch. "The story I'm going to tell the board is one of hidden depths. I met you years ago, we reconnected, and I've been supporting your charity work. It sounds noble. It sounds like the kind of thing a man with a heart would do. Plus you have a look that can't be faked, a certain resilience. You want to use my misery to make yourself look like a saint," Elena said, her voice flat. "I want to use your presence to secure my position," Julian countered. "In return, Leo gets a warm bed, 3 meals a day, and you get enough money to start a new life anywhere you want. It's a contract, Elena, nothing more." The next few days were an ordeal of refinement. Julian's assistant, Sarah, arrived with a team of tailors and beauticians. Elena was scrubbed, polished, and draped in silks and wools that cost more than she had earned in 5 years of working retail before the layoff and the subsequent spiral into debt. While Elena was being transformed, Leo became a fixture in the penthouse. At first, the boy was silent, a shadow following his mother. But children are resilient. Soon, he was exploring. Julian, who had never spent more than 5 minutes with a child, found himself constantly interrupted. One evening, Julian was working on a merger bridge when he felt a tug on his sleeve. Leo was standing there, holding a small plastic dinosaur, the only toy he had brought from the street. "Can he fly?" Leo asked, pointing to the window. "No," Julian said, not looking up. "Gravity applies to plastic as much as it does to us." "But he has wings," Leo insisted. Julian looked down. The dinosaur was a pterodactyl. He sighed, closing his laptop. "Fine, if we consider the lift-to-weight ratio in this simulated environment, yes, he can fly." He picked up the toy and made a brief, awkward swooping motion. Leo giggled. It was a sound Julian hadn't heard in years, unfiltered joy. It felt like a discordant note in his perfectly tuned life. Eleanor walked into the room then, wearing a simple navy blue sheath dress. The transformation was startling. Without the grime and the oversized coat, she was stunning. But more than that, she carried herself with a quiet authority. She saw Julian holding the toy and paused, a soft expression crossing her face before she masked it. "He likes you," she said. "He's a child." "He likes anyone who acknowledges his toys," Julian said, standing up and smoothing his suit. "We have a dinner tonight with one of the junior partners. It's a trial run. Remember the story. We met in college, lost touch, and reunited 6 months ago. You've been living in upstate New York doing community outreach." "I can play the part," Elena said. "But don't forget, Julian, that behind the dress, I'm still the woman you found on the street, and you're still the man who thinks he can buy a soul." The dinner was a success. Eleanor was charming, articulate, and possessed a natural grace that Julian's peers found refreshing. She didn't talk about stocks, she talked about people. She spoke of the struggles of small-town families with a passion that made the junior partner lean in, mesmerized. Julian watched her, feeling a strange tightening in his chest. It wasn't just that she was doing a good job, it was that for the first time people weren't looking at him with fear or envy. They were looking at him with warmth, reflected off her. As they rode the elevator back to the penthouse, Julian remained silent. "Did I do something wrong?" Eleanor asked. "No," Julian said softly. "You did everything right, that's the problem." He realized then that the asset was becoming a liability to his cynicism. He was starting to see the woman behind the contract, and she was far more dangerous to his world than the board of directors could ever be. The days leading up to the gala were a whirlwind of preparation. Julian found himself spending more time at the penthouse and less at the office. He told himself it was to coach Elena, but in reality he was drawn to the atmosphere she had created. The apartment no longer felt like a museum. It smelled of actual food and echoed with Leo's laughter. However, reality had a way of intruding. One afternoon, Julian returned home to find Elena in the kitchen, her face pale, staring at a stack of documents on the island. They were her medical records and Leo's school transcripts, things Julian's private investigator had dug up to flesh out her backstory. "You went through my life," she said, her voice trembling. "You looked at my failures like they were data points." "I needed to know who I was bringing into my home," Julian said defensively. "I needed to ensure there were no surprises that the press could find." "My husband dying wasn't a surprise, Julian. Losing our home because the insurance company found a loophole wasn't a data point. That was my life falling apart." She threw the papers at him. "You sit up here and judge the world, but you have no idea what it's like to have the floor vanish beneath your feet." Julian looked at the papers scattered on the floor. He saw the death certificate of Elena's husband, a victim of a hit-and-run 3 years ago. He saw the eviction notices. He saw the assets he had so coldly calculated. "I'm sorry," Julian said. The words felt heavy and unfamiliar in his mouth. Elena looked at him, surprised by the admission. "Are you? Or are you just sorry that the human side of your project is talking back?" "I'm sorry about your husband," Julian clarified, stepping closer. "I lost my parents when I was young. I spent my life building walls so I would never be that vulnerable again. I thought if I controlled everything, the money, the reputation, the career, I would be safe. Seeing your files, it reminded me that nobody is ever truly safe." For a moment the tension shifted. Elena saw the lonely boy beneath the CFO's expensive suit. She reached out, her hand hovering near his arm before she drew it back. "Safety is an illusion, Julian, but kindness isn't. You should try it sometime without a contract attached." That night, Julian couldn't sleep. He walked into the living room and found Leo sitting on the sofa, staring at the city lights. "Can't sleep?" Julian asked. "It's too quiet," Leo said. "In the park there was always noise. Cars, people, the wind. Here it's like being in a box." Julian sat down beside him. "It's a very expensive box, Leo." "Do we have to go back to the park after the party?" Leo asked, his voice small. Julian felt a sharp pang in his chest. He had planned this as a 2-week transaction. He had never considered what happened on day 15. "We'll see," he said, the standard non-committal answer of an executive. But as he looked at the boy, he knew seeing wouldn't be enough. The next morning, Julian made a phone call, not to a lawyer or an investor, but to a real estate agent. He told himself it was contingency planning, but the truth was beginning to bleed through his cold exterior. Meanwhile, Eleanor was preparing for the gala. She had chosen a gown of emerald green that made her look like royalty. But as she looked in the mirror, she didn't see a CFO's wife. She saw a mother who was doing whatever it took to save her son. She knew Julian was using her, but she also saw the changes in him, the way he stayed for breakfast, the way he looked at Leo. She wondered if the man who lived in the glass fortress was finally starting to let the light in. But the world of high finance is a shark tank, and Julian wasn't the only one playing a game. At the office, Marcus was receiving a different set of files. Files about a certain homeless woman Julian Thorne had been seen with in a park. The board was indeed getting a story, but it wasn't the one Julian had planned. The Foundations of Hope Gala was held at the Metropolitan Museum of Art. It was an ocean of tuxedos, diamonds, and whispered power plays. Julian felt Elena's hand tremble as they stepped out of the limousine. He instinctively covered her hand with his, offering a firm, reassuring squeeze. "Just be yourself," Julian whispered. "The woman who reads to her son in the dark. That woman is more impressive than anyone in this room." Elena looked at him, eyes wide. "You've never said anything like that before." "I've never had a reason to," Julian replied. As they entered the ballroom, they were immediately swarmed. Julian introduced Elena as his wife, and she handled the introductions with a poise that silenced the skeptics. She spoke about her foundation work with such conviction, drawing on her real-life experiences in shelters, that the investors were moved. They saw Julian in a new light, a man who had chosen a woman of substance over a socialite. Everything was going perfectly until they encountered Marcus near the bar. The CEO was flanked by 2 members of the board. "Julian, and the lovely Eleanor," Marcus said, his smile not reaching his eyes. "We were just discussing your remarkable story, truly a modern-day fairy tale, as the press might call it." "Thank you, Marcus," Julian said, sensing the trap. "In fact," Marcus continued, "we were so inspired that we decided to do some outreach of our own. We looked into the shelter where Eleanor supposedly runs her programs. It's strange, Julian. We couldn't find her name on any of the staff lists. We did, however, find her name on a police report for sleeping in a public park 3 weeks ago." The silence that followed was deafening. The surrounding guests began to whisper. Elena felt the blood drain from her face. Julian felt the world he had built, the carefully curated image, begin to crumble. "Is there something you'd like to tell the board, Julian?" Marcus asked, his tone dripping with fake concern. "Is this a marriage or a desperate PR stunt? Because if it's the latter, your integrity as CFO is officially in question." Julian looked at Elena. She looked devastated, ready to run. He looked at the board members, their faces judgmental and cold. He thought about the Ice King he was supposed to be. He thought about the contract. Then he thought about Leo and the dinosaur. "It wasn't a PR stunt," Julian said, his voice ringing out clearly across the room. He stepped away from Marcus and stood directly beside Elena, his arm around her waist. "I didn't hire her to save my image. I found her in that park because I was a man who had everything and realized I had nothing. Elena and Leo didn't need my money nearly as much as I needed their perspective. If you want to talk about integrity, let's talk about a board that judges a woman for her misfortunes rather than her character." The room went silent again, but this time it was a silence of shock. Julian continued, "I lied about our history because I knew how narrow-minded this world is, but I'm not lying about this. Elena is the most honest thing in my life. If my association with a woman who has survived more than any of you could imagine is a liability, then I don't want to be your CFO." He turned to Elena. "Let's go home." They walked out of the gala, heads held high, leaving the elite of New York in a state of stunned disbelief. In the car, Elena started to cry. Not out of sadness, but out of sheer, overwhelming relief. "You threw it all away," she sobbed. "Your job, your reputation." "For me? I didn't throw it away," Julian said, looking out the window as the museum disappeared behind them. "I just finally made a good investment, one with a return you can't measure in dollars." But as they reached the penthouse, Julian's phone began to blow up. The news was already hitting the blogs. CFO Julian Thorne admits to fraudulent marriage to homeless woman. The scandal was massive. Julian didn't care, or at least he tried not to. The next morning, however, Julian found the penthouse empty. A note sat on the kitchen island. "Julian, you saved us in a way I can't describe, but I won't let my past destroy your future. You need your world, and I don't belong in it. I've taken the money you gave me for the contract. It's enough for a start. Please don't look for us. Thank you for the dinosaurs. Eleanor." Julian felt a hollow ache in his chest that no amount of money could fill. He had found his heart, only to lose the people who had given it back to him. The weeks following the gala were a nightmare of legal battles and corporate restructuring. Julian was placed on administrative leave. The press hounded him, but he refused to give interviews. He spent his days in the silent penthouse, staring at the guest wing. He found a small plastic dinosaur under the sofa, the pterodactyl. He kept it in his pocket like a talisman. He realized he didn't know anything about where Eleanor might go. He had been so focused on her backstory that he hadn't asked about her dreams. He hired the best private investigator he knew, not to dig up dirt this time, but to find the light. "Find them," Julian told the investigator. "I don't care about the cost. Just find them." Meanwhile, Eleanor and Leo were in a small town in Pennsylvania. Using the money Julian had provided, she had rented a modest apartment and found work at a local library. She wanted to disappear, to give Leo a normal life, far from the cameras and the cold brilliance of New York. But every time she saw a man in a dark suit, her heart skipped a beat. She missed the man who had defended her in a room full of sharks. Back in New York, the board of Sterling and Vance was realizing their mistake. Without Julian's clinical precision, the textile merger was falling apart. The stock price was dipping. The human replacement they had brought in was incompetent. Marcus came to Julian's penthouse. "The board wants you back, Julian. They're willing to issue a statement saying the whole homeless story was a misunderstanding. We can spin it as a philanthropic experiment gone wrong. Just come back and fix the numbers." Julian looked at Marcus, the man who had tried to humiliate Eleanor. "I'm not coming back for the numbers, Marcus. And I'm not spinning anything. I'm moving to Pennsylvania." "Pennsylvania? What's in Pennsylvania?" "Everything I should have valued from the start," Julian said. The investigator had found her. She was living in a town called Oakhaven. Julian didn't call, he didn't send a car. He got behind the wheel of his own vehicle and drove. He arrived at the library just as Elena was closing up. The sun was setting, casting long shadows across the quiet street. When she saw him leaning against his car, she froze. "You shouldn't be here," she said, her voice trembling. "I disagree," Julian said. "I've run the numbers, Elena. My life without you and Leo is a net loss. There is no growth, no future, and the overhead of being alone is too high." Elena laughed, a tear rolling down her cheek. "You're still talking like a CFO. It's the only way I know how to say I love you," Julian admitted, walking toward her. "I don't want a contract, I don't want an image. I want to know if you'll let me be part of your community outreach, permanently." Leo ran out of the library then, seeing Julian. "Julian, did you bring the dinosaur?" Julian reached into his pocket and pulled out the pterodactyl. "I brought him home, Leo." Living in Oakhaven was a radical departure for Julian. He swapped his bespoke suits for flannels and his penthouse for a refurbished farmhouse on the edge of town. He didn't return to Sterling and Vance. Instead, he used his considerable wealth to start a new venture, the Thorne Vance Foundation. Unlike other charities, this one focused on economic resilience, providing immediate housing and job placement for families who had fallen through the cracks, just as Elena had. Elena was the executive director. She brought the heart. Julian brought the strategy. It was a perfect merger. However, the transition wasn't without its challenges. The townspeople were suspicious of the city slicker who had arrived with a scandal attached to his name. Julian had to learn to earn trust rather than buy it. He spent his weekends helping fix the local school's budget and teaching Leo how to ride a bike, a task far more difficult than any hostile takeover he had ever managed. One evening, as they sat on the porch of their farmhouse, Elena looked at the peaceful horizon. "Do you ever miss it? The power? The view from the top?" Julian looked at her, then at Leo playing with a golden retriever in the yard. "I used to think the view from the top was the only one that mattered because it made everyone else look small. But from here, everything looks exactly the size it's supposed to be. Especially us." Their peace was interrupted a few months later by a familiar face. Marcus arrived in a sleek black car, looking out of place among the cornfields. "I'm not here for the firm," Marcus said, holding up his hands. "I'm here because I'm retiring. The board is a mess, Julian. They want to sell the company to a private equity firm that will strip it bare. Thousands of people will lose their jobs. I know you don't care about the board, but I thought you might care about the people." Julian looked at Elena. She nodded slowly. "You can help them, Julian. Not for the image, but for the truth." Julian turned back to Marcus. "I'll help, but on one condition. Sterling and Vance becomes the primary financier for the Foundation's national expansion. We don't just save the company, we use the company to save others." Marcus smiled. "I figured you'd find a way to make it a win-win." Julian Thorne stepped off the elevator onto the 42nd floor of the Sterling and Vance headquarters, and for the first time in his career, he didn't feel like he was entering a battlefield. He felt like he was entering a room that needed cleaning. The air was thick with the scent of expensive coffee and desperation. The Ice King had returned, but the man under the charcoal suit was someone entirely new. The employees stared. They had read the headlines, seen the paparazzi photos of him in a flannel shirt in Pennsylvania, and they expected a breakdown. Instead, they saw a man with a steady gaze and a calm that was far more intimidating than his old temper. In the boardroom, the air was cold. The mahogany table was surrounded by men and women who viewed the world as a series of harvests. Take what you can, leave the soil barren. Marcus sat at the head, looking weary. Opposite him were the representatives of Vulture Capital, the firm ready to strip Sterling and Vance for parts. "You're late, Julian," one of the board members sneered. "We were just about to vote on the liquidation. Then I arrived just in time to save you from a mathematical catastrophe," Julian said, tossing a thick leather-bound folder onto the table. It landed with a heavy thud. For the next 3 hours, Julian dismantled their logic. He didn't appeal to their pity. He appealed to their greed, but he rewired it. He showed them how the current liquidation plan would trigger massive tax penalties and legal entanglements that would eat 40% of their projected profits. Then, he unveiled the resilience model. By pivoting the firm's investment arm to focus on sustainable housing and community-backed infrastructure, funded by the very foundation he and Elena had built, the firm would receive unprecedented federal tax credits and, more importantly, long-term stability in a volatile market. "You want a quick kill," Julian said, leaning over the table. "I'm offering you an empire that won't collapse when the next recession hits. You save 30,000 jobs, you rebuild the firm's reputation, and your dividends increase by 12% over 3 years. It's not charity, it's superior math." The room was silent. The logic was airtight. The ethics were a byproduct of the efficiency. By the time the sun began to set over the Hudson River, the vote was unanimous. The hostile takeover was dead. The takeover of hope had begun. Julian didn't wait for the champagne. He didn't want to hear their congratulations. He walked out of the building, past the security guards he used to ignore, and whispered a thank you to the receptionist. He took a yellow cab to Penn Station, his heart racing not from a deal, but from the anticipation of a destination. The train ride to Pennsylvania was a blur of dark fields and flickering townlights. When he finally stepped onto the damp wooden platform of the Oakhaven station, the air smelled of rain and pine, not smog and ozone. He saw them immediately under the glow of a flickering street lamp. Leo was jumping up and down, holding a piece of cardboard that was slightly soggy from the mist. It read, "Welcome home, Dad." Julian froze. He had closed billion-dollar mergers, but that 3-letter word shattered his remaining defenses. He dropped his briefcase, thousands of dollars of equipment and documents, and knelt on the wet ground. Leo collided with him like a small, warm comet. "I missed you, Julian, Dad," Leo shouted into his neck. Julian squeezed him, his eyes stinging. He looked up to see Elena standing a few feet away, her coat wrapped tight, a look of profound pride and relief on her face. Julian stood up, still holding the boy, and pulled her into the circle. "The merger is complete," Julian whispered into her hair, the scent of her shampoo grounding him more than any office ever could. "Which one?" she asked softly, leaning her forehead against his. "The only one that matters," he replied. "I'm done with the city, Elena. I'm home." The peace of the farmhouse was shattered 3 months later by a man in a cheap suit carrying a manila envelope. Elena had been in the garden, her hands stained with the rich, dark soil of Pennsylvania, when she was served. Arthur Vance, a distant, embittered cousin of Elena's late husband, had surfaced. He had seen the national news stories about the CFO and the homeless Cinderella and saw a payday. He filed for emergency custody of Leo, citing Elena's documented history of vagrancy and child endangerment. The evening the news hit, the farmhouse felt cold again. Elena sat at the kitchen table, her face ashen. "He doesn't even know Leo's middle name," she whispered. "He just wants a settlement. He thinks you'll pay him to go away." Julian's jaw tightened. The old Julian, the one who broke companies for sport, wanted to call his fleet of New York lawyers and bury Arthur Vance in so much litigation he'd never see the sun. He wanted to use his wealth as a weapon. "I'll destroy him," Julian growled, reaching for his phone. "No," Eleanor said, her voice firm as she placed her hand over his. "That's how the Ice King fights. If we use money to win, we prove his point, that everything we have is bought. We fight this with the truth of who we are now. We show the court what a real family looks like." The day of the hearing in the local county courthouse was grey and biting. The courtroom was small, smelling of old paper and floor wax. Arthur Vance sat across the aisle looking smug, flanked by a lawyer who looked like he'd chased every ambulance in the tri-state area. They presented photos of Elena from the park, haggard, dirty, looking unstable. They played on the judge's prejudices about the homeless. When it was Julian's turn to take the stand, the room went quiet. He didn't look like a billionaire. He wore a simple suit and no watch. "Mr. Thorne," the opposing lawyer began, "can you deny that when you met the defendant, she was living in a state of squalor that was dangerous for a child?" I can't deny she was in a park, Julian said, his voice calm and resonant. But squalor is a word used by people who have never had to choose between their pride and their child's meal. I saw a woman who, in the middle of a New York winter, gave her son her only coat. I saw a woman who read stories to her child to drown out the sound of the city because she refused to let his imagination starve, even if his belly was empty. Julian leaned forward, looking directly at the judge. I spent my life evaluating assets. I thought I was the one saving her. But the truth is, I was the one who was bankrupt. I had a penthouse and $1 billion portfolio, and I was the most miserable man in that city. Elena didn't have a roof, but she had a home within herself. She gave Leo safety in her arms. I am here today not as a benefactor, but as a man who was adopted by them. If you take Leo from her, you aren't protecting him. You are tearing the heart out of the only stable thing this world has ever offered any of us. The courtroom was silent for a long beat. Arthur Vance tried to speak, but the judge held up a hand. She looked at Leo, who was sitting in the back with a social worker, clutching his pterodactyl. The case wasn't just dismissed. The judge issued a scathing rebuke of Arthur's predatory litigation. As they walked out of the courthouse, Julian didn't look at the defeated cousin. He took the adoption papers he had been working on for weeks and handed them to Elena. I want it to be official, he said. Not for the court, for us. That afternoon, in a small office with a sun-drenched window, Julian Thorne signed his name on a document that didn't involve stocks or bonds. He became Leo's father. As they walked out into the crisp air, Leo looked up and asked, "Does this mean we're a real team now?" "The best team in the league," Julian said, hoisting the boy onto his shoulders. A year had passed since the court case, and the transformation of the Thorne family was mirrored by the transformation of the town of Oakhaven. The Thorne Vance Foundation wasn't just a name on a building, it was a living, breathing entity. Julian had designed an incremental housing program that had already moved 10,000 families off the streets and into dignity. It was Leo's 7th birthday, and the farmhouse was a riot of color and noise. There were no black-tie waiters or stiff conversations. Instead, the yard was filled with local kids, the smell of charcoal-grilled burgers, and the sound of a golden retriever barking at a sprinkler. Julian stood on the porch, a glass of iced tea in his hand, watching the scene. He felt a strange sensation in his chest, a warmth that had become his new normal. He remembered the Ice King Gala, where he had felt so alone in a room of 500 people. Here, surrounded by 20, he felt like the center of the universe. As the sun began to dip below the rolling hills, casting a golden-orange glow over the fields, Julian called Leo over. "I have something for you. It's not a toy." He led Leo to a tripod, set up on the highest point of the porch. It was a professional-grade telescope, its brass fittings gleaming in the twilight. "Why is it so big?" Leo asked, peering into the lens. "Because," Julian said, kneeling beside him, "when we were in the city, you looked up at the skyscrapers and thought that was the top of the world. I want you to see that the world is much bigger than any building. I want you to see that the stars are just as bright from this old farm as they are from a penthouse. Success isn't about how high you climb, it's about how much of the sky you can see from where you stand." Leo looked through the glass, gasping, as the craters of the moon came into focus. "It looks like I can touch it." "You can," Elena said, joining them. She wrapped her arms around Julian's waist, leaning her head on his shoulder. Later, after the cake had been eaten and the last guest had driven away, the house grew quiet. The crickets began their nightly chorus. Julian and Elena stood by the window, looking out at the silhouettes of the trees. "You really did it, Julian," Elena whispered. "You turned a lie, that fake marriage, that PR stunt, into a life. You saved us." Julian turned to her, taking her hands in his. Her skin was warm, a contrast to the cold marble he used to surround himself with. "No, Elena, you have it backwards. I was the one living a lie. I was the one who was lost, pretending that numbers could fill the hole in my life. You showed me that the life I was living was the fantasy. This mess, this noise, this love. This is the only real thing I've ever done." He looked at the empty guest wing of the house. now filled with Leo's school projects and mud-tracked boots. He realized that his greatest achievement wasn't the 12% dividend or the saved firm. It was the fact that he no longer knew what his net worth was, and he didn't care. Time flowed differently in Oakhaven. The years weren't marked by quarterly reports, but by the height of the corn and the depth of the winter snow. Julian eventually retired from the foundation's daily operations, passing the torch to a new generation of empathetic leaders. He took a position as a guest lecturer at the local university, teaching a course titled The Human Variable in Economics. His students, who knew him only as the kind, sharp-witted professor, had no idea he was once the most feared man on Wall Street. Elena became a national figure, a mother of the invisible, testifying before Congress and building a network of shelters that focused on keeping families together rather than tearing them apart. But to Julian, she was simply the woman who still read stories by the fireplace every night. Leo grew tall and strong. He possessed his mother's empathy and Julian's analytical mind. He didn't want to be a CFO. He wanted to be an architect, someone who built things that lasted. On Julian's 50th birthday, the family gathered for a quiet dinner. Leo, now a college student with a bright future, stood up to give a toast. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small velvet box. "When I was 5 years old," Leo began, his voice thick with emotion, "I lived in a park. I had one toy, a plastic dinosaur with broken wings. I thought that was all I would ever have. Then I met a man who didn't know how to smile, but he knew how to keep a promise." Leo opened the box. Inside was a gold lapel pin, exquisitely crafted in the shape of a pterodactyl. "To the man who taught me that even things made of plastic or hearts made of ice can learn to fly," Leo said, his eyes meeting Julian's. "Happy birthday, Dad." Julian took the pin, his fingers trembling. He pinned it to his sweater right over his heart. It was the most valuable piece of jewelry he had ever owned. The story of the CFO and the homeless mum became a legend in the business world, a case study in the Thorne effect. But in the farmhouse in Oakhaven, it was just the family history. Julian had learned that the greatest transactions in life don't happen on a balance sheet. They happen in the moments when we choose to see the person in front of us, not as a liability or an asset, but as a soul. The glass fortress of his youth was a distant memory. In its place was a home with creaky floorboards, open doors, and a warm hearth. Julian Thorne died many years later, an old man held by his son and his wife. He left behind no skyscrapers with his name on them and no massive corporate monuments. Instead, he left behind thousands of families with roofs over their heads and a son who knew how to love. And as the townspeople would say for generations, he never once regretted the day he decided to buy a family, because in the end, they were the ones who gave him his life for free. The pterodactyl pin was passed down to Leo's children, a golden reminder that no matter how cold the world gets, there is always enough light to find your way home.